Welcome to Luna's English.
Most English learners believe they must study with a native English teacher. But is that actually true? The answer might surprise you. Welcome back to the Luna's English, the podcast teaching English in context so you can learn naturally. On today's episode, I want to explore this issue, whether or not you need to have a native English speaker be your teacher and help you on your English learning journey. If you are new to the podcast, you might not know that I teach English online to students who are learning it as a foreign language. And on today's episode, I want to go over the pros and the cons of having someone who is not a native English speaker, so you can determine if it would be good for you and when you might want to use someone who is a non-native English-speaking teacher. So if you're interested in learning about these pros and cons and trying to figure out whether or not it might be a good fit for you, then follow along because we're about to begin. Before we get started, want to remind you to look at the description of this podcast episode. There you will find the words and phrases that I use in the episode, so you can take them and start building your English vocabulary. Let's start talking about having a non-native English teacher, and we're going to start with the pros of why this might be a good idea. I've had a number of students tell me that they have used someone who does not speak English natively, but who speaks it at a very high level. I think the biggest pro is when this type of teacher speaks your native language, and when you are just beginning to learn English. If you are at the beginning of your English learning journey, then maybe you have difficulty understanding a native speaker. Maybe you're struggling to understand what I am saying now, and it would be difficult to have an entire lesson in English because you wouldn't be able to understand everything. If you have a teacher who speaks your native language and speaks English to a very high level, then they can communicate with you and you can better understand them. They can explain concepts to you. They can answer any questions you might have. This is not really possible if you have someone who does not speak your native language. I can say from personal experience, I took lessons to try to learn Spanish, and when I was a beginner, I did take a lesson with a native Spanish-speaking teacher. He did not speak English, and it was challenging. I only did that one time, because I did get a little bit confused. This might be a really good use of your time and of your resources if you decide to use someone who speaks your native language, but then also can explain those English concepts to you. The second pro is that this person would also be able to explain the grammar to you. When you have someone who is a native English speaker, a lot of the time they do not know the grammar rules. They speak English very well, they can tell you what sounds right or wrong, but they might not be able to explain why. They don't know the names for all of the grammar rules, for example, and that's because we don't actually learn those in school. We do learn some, we do know some basic grammar, but if you were to go up to the average American and ask them, how many verb tenses do you have in English? They'll probably look at you a little bit funny. But if you have a non-native English-speaking teacher, they have studied those grammar rules. They have learned English in a way that is different from the way a native speaker has learned it. So they're better able to explain those grammar rules to you because they know they exist, they know what the reasoning is behind them, and they can give you a really good explanation about why something is said one way versus another. The third pro is that they're able to make comparisons between English and your native language. If you have someone who knows your language and knows English to a really high level, they're able to tell you about the similarities and the differences. When I teach someone who is a Spanish-speaking student, I am able to make some comparisons between Spanish and English because I do know some level of Spanish, but I'm not able to make that comparison, which can be really helpful when you are trying to learn a language. The fourth pro is that they can provide really good study material and can be a good role model for you. If they know your language and they've learned English to this really high level where they're able to teach it themselves, you know that they have used a lot of material to study from along the way. They have resources that they can tell you about. They can tell you what study material they used And that material is most likely going to be in English, but also in your native language. They can tell you exactly how they got fluent in English, and that can be a really good source of inspiration. That can help you stay motivated because you have someone who speaks your language, but also speaks English to the level that you want to reach. That's really a good thing, I think. Having someone who can show you that it is possible. You can reach that really high level of fluency of English. And the last pro is that they're able to empathize with you. They have gone through this exact journey that you are on right now. They know exactly how difficult it was to learn English. I know I am able to empathize a little bit with my students. I know exactly how difficult it has been for me to learn Spanish, so I understand how difficult it is to learn a second language. But I'm not able to relate exactly to what they are going through. For me, English is my native language. I learned it as a child, so I don't know that struggle exactly. I'm able to relate because I am learning a second language, but I don't understand everything that they're going through. If you have someone who has gone through that journey, they are able to empathize with you. They know where you might make mistakes along the way. They can tell you where they made mistakes because of the differences between your language and English, and that is a good resource to have. It's just sometimes nice to have that support, have someone who can relate to you and understand what you're going through while you're learning English. Now let's turn to the cons. The first con of having a non-native English-speaking teacher is that sometimes the pronunciation or the phrases that they use can be a little bit odd. Over the years, I've had a number of students from China, and I've been told from my Chinese students that the English teachers that they have when they are in school are not native English speakers. They are Chinese people who have learned English and who are now teaching English. And that's great. That's what you have to use if that's what's available. But I have heard over the years some mistakes when my students are speaking. I've heard some weird phrases that they use in conversation, and they have told me that the pronunciation that they're using or the phrases or rules that they're using came from their non-native English-speaking teachers. For example, with many of my Chinese students, when they're saying that they want to be more fluent when they're speaking English, they have told me they want to improve their oral English. A native English speaker, at least in the United States, is never going to say oral English. They will say speaking ability. I don't know where oral English comes from. I don't know if maybe that's a British term or something from a different country, but an American speaker will never say that term. And I've heard it from multiple students, and they have told me that that is what it is called in China. In the education system, they use the term oral English. Again, that is odd to me. It's not something I would ever say, and I have told them if you are talking to someone who's from the United States, don't say that. Instead, say you want to improve your speaking ability. I've also had students tell me about some grammar rules, some differences between some words that they were taught from their teachers in China or in whatever country they're in when they were learning English. And the rules that they told me were rules that I had never heard of, and the examples they gave me were just not correct. The second con is they just naturally don't have the same level of depth in the language as a native speaker would. Now, I am not talking about grammar rules. Like I said, most Americans are not able to explain every grammar rule of the English language. We are just not taught that. But we do know our language and how it's used. We can tell you what sounds correct versus what sounds incorrect. We can tell you the difference of two very similar words and why you would use one versus the other. We can tell you what one word has for its context, whether it's negative or positive versus another. So two words might have the same meaning, but one might be more negative term, and one might be a more positive term. For example, I did an episode on advanced English words to help your English vocabulary, and I did them in pairs, where I used two similar words or terms, and I talked about the differences, even though they meant the same thing, what the context differences were, what the very subtle meaning differences were between the two. Now, these are terms that we use usually when we're making an argument or trying to explain something, the reasoning behind something, and why something is the way that it is. And they're very similar. However, my student was trying to say that they were very different, and you only use one in one context and one in a completely different context. And she said that her teacher had explained this and was very strict about the rules. And I was listening to her, and I thought, no, that's completely wrong. That is not what an American would say. Again, maybe they were learning a different type of English from a different country, but in the United States, we use those two words the exact same, thus and therefore are interchangeable. And I learned that when I was in school, that you could use either one of those. So sometimes when you do have a non-native speaking teacher, they could make those mistakes, right? It's possible for them to not be able to fully understand the differences between similar words. Maybe they make some odd rules that don't really exist, or they think something is a particular way when it might not be. And that's just something, again, to watch out for if you are using this type of teacher. The third con I have already mentioned, but it is the overt reliance on grammar rules. I think grammar gets taught way too much to people who are trying to learn English as a second language. We do not learn grammar to that high of a level when we are in school. We can tell you the difference between a noun and a verb and an adjective, of course. We know what pronouns are, but we don't know every single little tiny rule. And I don't really know why, when you are learning a second language, grammar gets taught so much, why verb tenses get stressed so much. I don't think that is really necessary. One time, I saw another English teacher, and he was saying that every time he teaches his students a new verb, he makes them write the verb in a sentence in every single verb tense. So they have to give him 19 different sentences with all of these different verb tenses. And I just thought that was a little ridiculous. Maybe that is your style, maybe you really love grammar, but I thought it was a waste of time. I think it is so much more important to acquire a language, to listen to native content, to have your brain absorb the material by having that contact time with a language. And I think that's really way more important than learning every single tiny little grammar rule about the English language. We have talked a number of times about the input hypothesis, about Steve Kaufman and Steve Krashen. I will leave links to the episodes where I have talked about the input hypothesis, but I think it's so much more important for your brain to be exposed to the language and just naturally absorb the language. And I don't think that if you're spending all of your time on grammar, that it's an effective use of your time. And the last con is the risk of relying on your native language. Now, I said it was a pro that someone who speaks your language is able to explain something to you if you're confused. If you don't understand what they're saying in English, they can switch and explain it to you in your native language. And that's really a huge pro. I think that is a great thing. However, if you are relying on that too much, that really risks wasting your time. If you are spending the entire lesson in your native language and not in English, that really is a waste of time. You want to try to spend as much time as you can in English. This can be very difficult as a beginner, and I understand that. But once you get to the point where you can spend more time in English, you really want to do that. It is much easier to speak in your native language, right? We all know that. I am the most comfortable speaking in English, but if I'm trying to learn another language, I want to try to speak and listen to that native language as much as possible. I don't want to spend my entire lesson in English if I don't have to.
And I've had this experience. I have had students who are Spanish-speaking students who want to speak Spanish with me. I will ask them a question in English. They will struggle to try to answer, and then they'll just go right into Spanish and want to stay in Spanish. And they'll start talking to me in Spanish. And when they say something, I will respond in English because I am trying to push them out of that habit. It is a lot easier. It would be fun to just have a conversation in Spanish, but they can already do that. You have friends, you have family members who speak your native language. If you are taking a lesson, you want to try to live with that uncomfortableness of speaking a different language. It is uncomfortable, it is a struggle, but you have to embrace that. So if you are going to use someone who is not a native English speaker, but speaks your language as well as English, really push yourself and just keep that in mind to try to spend as much time as you can in English. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it helped you with the pros and some of the potential cons of having a non-native English-speaking teacher. I hope I was able to cover a lot of the benefits and some of the potential challenges, so you're better able to decide what type of teacher you would like to have on your next stage of your English learning journey.
I also hope you were able to reflect and think back on the types of teachers you have had in the past. If you have had a non-native speaking teacher, please tell me about it and let me know. Let me know if I missed any of the pros that maybe you experienced or any of the potential cons. I would love to know more about people's experiences. Like I said, this list was really from my students who I've had who have told me about this and their experience with having a non-native English-speaking teacher. But tell me about it if I missed anything or if you agree or disagree with anything that I said. If the podcast is helping you overall, if it's helping you learn English, then please consider leaving us a rating on whatever app you are using to listen to this podcast on. You can also tell a friend, tell a family member, tell someone who is learning English to help us grow our audience and reach more people. You can also follow us on social media at Luna's English. Remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode when it comes out next day. Until then, keep learning English.